welcome to CrossView Radio, podcast for Wayne County. I'm John Marino, pastor of CrossView Church, Norville. We exist to glorify God by exalting Christ and magnifying the gospel for the joy of all nations. You have all been there before. You're walking through the grocery store. When you see him or her out of the corner of your eye, you quickly look away, hoping that she didn't see you see her. Of course, you know by experience the consequences that will befall you if she were to see you. You would find yourself locked in a hostage situation, forced to listen to her go on in 8K Ultra HD detail about the most recent offenses she's had to endure and the follies of 1,000 people. She'll tell you of her husband's shortcomings, her coworker's folly, the government's failure, and everything that is bad in her world. The sad reality is that everybody sees it except her. When she walks into the office, everyone rolls their eyes. When she walks into church, everyone suddenly has to detour down the back hallway. When she gets home, her husband makes sure that he's got plenty of yard work to do for the evening. And though she's about as observant as a brick wall, she sometimes wonders why everyone is so busy all the time and nobody has any time to spare for her to bare her heart. Some people might call her a Karen, but fewer people understand why she is the way that she is and how she got to this point. No, this is not a podcast about Karens. Rather, it's a podcast about dealing with the source of this obsession with offenses, which is bitterness. The book of Hebrews issues a warning in Hebrews 12:15. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. Of course, this illness doesn't affect just women. It's a disease that affects both the male and female members of humanity. It's interesting to me that many times, though not all times, the rotten fruit of bitterness is readily apparent and very visible to everybody else, but it is often invisible to the person who is bitter. Perhaps the condition comes equipped with its own paralyzing agent, rendering the victim unable to exercise even the most basic form of self-awareness. Of course, the biblical term for this paralyzing agent is self-deception, and I'd say that in my experience, it is often the case that bitterness and self-deception make frequent bedfellows. Like a horse wearing blinders, so too the bitter man remains oblivious to his surroundings. One of the reasons to tackle the topic of bitterness is because it's so prevalent in our society today. In fact, I'm almost inclined to say that 100% of people have experienced it to some degree or another. I know I have. When I do biblical counseling, bitterness is almost always a contributing factor to the problem. We talked about bitterness briefly during the podcast on trauma, and I said way back then that I wanted to circle back and hit this topic in a little more detail, and so here we are. You have no doubt driven down the road, and you see all of these well-kept houses, and then there's one that has weeds that are 10 feet tall, and even little trees growing out of the gutters. Well, bitterness is kind of like that. In order to keep it at bay, you have to constantly pull the weeds, and you do that through forgiveness. If you stop forgiving, even for a day, your yard looks like it's been overrun. Where there was one weed yesterday, there are 2 today, and there'll be 4 tomorrow. When you don't take care of your yard, everybody else sees it, and eventually, you are the one who doesn't see it. In the same way, when you're bitter, you have all these weeds in your life, and everyone sees it except you. Except there's one thing that I have to modify in my illustration. Instead of seeing only one trashy house for every 100 houses, the reality of bitterness is that there's only one forgiving person for every 100 bitter people. It would seem to me, at least, that it's far more common to be bitter than it is to be forgiving. Thus, if our houses were a reflection of our hearts, almost every house would have 10-foot-tall weeds, trees in the gutters, grass that was never mowed, and groundhog holes peppered throughout the entire property. And so let's go ahead and dive into this topic of bitterness. Of course, we will start off as we normally do. Standard operating procedure here is to start off with definitions. I'd like to give this definition of bitterness according to D. Martin Lloyd-Jones. Quote, bitterness is a state of the spirit. It denotes a sort of persistent sourness and an absence of amiability. It is an unloving condition. Indeed, it is a condition which never sees any good in anything, but always contrives to see something wrong or some defect and deficiency. The proverb tells us that all seems yellow to the jaundiced eye, and the same is true about bitterness of spirit. It puts into everything it looks at some unworthy element. Because the person himself is jaundiced and bitter, everything he looks at is tinged by the same thing. It is like looking through colored spectacles, end quote. John MacArthur defines it this way, quote, bitterness reflects a smoldering resentment, a brooding, grudge-filled attitude. It is the spirit of irritability that keeps a person in perpetual animosity, making him sour and venomous, end quote. But bitterness is more than just a sour spirit. It's not merely a character disposition. No, bitterness, at least as defined by Scripture, is something that's very specific. Bitterness is the prolonged anger that results from the refusal to forgive someone. Let me say that again clearly, because this is going to be the working definition that we'll use throughout this series here, and that is this. Bitterness is the prolonged anger that results from the refusal to forgive someone. Therefore, there is only one cure to bitterness, and I'll give you that cure here right at the outset in case you'd rather not listen to me drone on today. The cure is simple. It is to forgive. It's actually really simple. Didn't say it was easy, but it is simple. And so we have here the definition and the cure at the outset. The definition is this. Bitterness is the prolonged anger that results from the refusal to forgive someone. The cure is to forgive. And that's about the extent of what we'll talk about in this series, except that we'll just kind of expand and illustrate and so on and so forth. But if you want to know what the core of this is about, it really is this definition and cure. And so let's go ahead and take a look at some of the symptoms of a bitter spirit. It's important to understand that we really could be done with the podcast now because I've given you the cure already. The problem is not with the diagnosis and cure. Rather, the problem is with human stubbornness. We have a million caveats and exceptions and considerations when it comes to bitterness, and we have a million reasons why we shouldn't forgive. The counseling room is an interesting place because one can clearly articulate the biblical imperative to forgive, but inevitably you'll always get the same answer. But you don't understand what he did to me. And of course, no truer words were spoken. The reality is, I don't understand what he did to you. The question that we have to ask ourselves at this point is this. If everything that was done against you could be taken into consideration, would that change God's prescription? I think we all know the answer to that biblically, at least. It's just the hardness of our own hearts that we have to work through. I recall a season in my own life where I was sinning against the Lord by harboring bitterness in my heart. And during college, I sought out counsel, and I received the same counsel that I'm giving you here today, and that is simple. You must forgive. Otherwise, your bitterness will destroy you. But as we are living in the real world and not the ideal, it's important to work through this topic bit by bit, and so let's jump into the symptoms. I think I have, 5 or 6 or something like that today, so we're going to start and go with the first one here. Number 1, bitterness. First symptom of bitterness. Bitterness has a steel trap memory. If you can remember that on September 2nd, 1997 at 4:38 p.m., he said such and such to you, you might be bitter. Jim Wilson, in his helpful little book, How to Be Free from Bitterness, says this, quote, "One good rule of thumb is this: bitterness remembers details. You have had thousands of conversations in your life, most of which you've forgotten. But this one took place 5 years ago, and you remember every single word, his inflection of every part of his voice. You know exactly what happened, which means you're bitter. Memory is helped by review, and more review. People do not usually mull over the wonderful things as much, but they do go over and over and over the bad things," end quote. In like manner, D. Martin Lloyd-Jones says, quote, "I grant that there may be genuine grievances, but what makes us bitter is that we ponder them and meditate upon them and stay with them. In other words, we nurse our grievances. We dwell on them. We pay great attention to them, and if we are tending to forget them, we deliberately bring them back and allow them to work us up again into a state of bitterness," end quote. And likewise, in the book Overcoming Bitterness, the author writes, quote, "We rehearse their shortcomings in our head, then broadcast their misdeeds with our words to anyone who will listen," end quote. The point here is that we must understand that having a sharp memory regarding details is a telltale sign that we are bitter. It is more common to be bitter against those whom you're closest to. Most people I've counseled are bitter against a parent, a relative, or a close friend. We're generally not bitter at strangers. If you vividly remember what your mom said to you, or what your dad did to you, or how your uncle hurt you, you might be bitter. You rehearse again and again and again. You relive the abuse or the hurt, always trying to rewrite the script so that you come out on top and your abuser or your oppressor is the one who suffers. People who forgive can move on. People who are bitter can't. That's why they're all stuck in the past. Sometimes at the hands of a therapist who makes you pick your scabs. It only takes a few sessions for you to get addicted to picking your scabs yourself, and before you know it, you're opening old wounds, thinking that you can now finally understand your trauma, when in fact you've just given yourself cancer. That's the first symptom. The second symptom is this: bitter people take poison, hoping the other person dies. It has long been said that bitterness is the poison you drink, hoping the other person dies. One surefire way to know if you're bitter is to evaluate your thoughts regarding the other person. Of course, this will look different from person to person, but perhaps maybe you lie awake at night rehearsing scenarios in your mind about how the other person might suffer or pay for what he's done to you. Perhaps you complain and murmur about them constantly. Perhaps you rehearse scenarios in your mind about what it would look like for you to talk to her in person, and you're always the victor in the conversation. You slowly long for his hurt, his harm, or his suffering. You hope that she gets what's coming to her, or that she finally understands how you feel, or that the tables are turned, the situation is reversed. The long-term result of this pattern is that you actually destroy yourself, not them. Just like cocaine distorts your face over the long haul, so too bitterness distorts your life in ways that you could never have imagined. You become ugly, you become unpleasant to be around, you become distorted and disfigured, and I would say sometimes even physically this happens to you. You become someone that nobody wants to be around in any way, shape, or form. That's the second symptom, is that bitter people take poison, hoping the other person dies. Number 3, bitter people are irritable and angry. This one's probably pretty elementary, but I want you to understand the connection between bitterness and anger. One of the realities about bitterness is that it is simply prolonged anger. It's like bringing water to a boil and then putting it on the back burner of your stove and letting it simmer. You may not necessarily have outbursts all the time, but you're always simmering, and you're always ready for an outburst should the situation call for it. Bitter people are irritable and angry, and it isn't always involving the issue at hand. You could be bitter at your mom from 20 years ago, and you snap at your son when he spills milk on the kitchen floor, or you yell at your husband because he forgot to take the trash out. What the writer of Hebrews warns against has become true in your life. Hebrews 12:15, again, see to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. The reality behind bitterness, according to this verse, is that bitter people cannot contain their bitterness. They cannot contain the damage that their bitterness causes. It just spills out and overflows in the lives of others all the time. The reality here is that there is flying shrapnel going out in all directions. We likewise see this in Ephesians 4:31 through 32. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as Christ forgave you. Bitterness goes along with wrath and anger. Point to me a man who is short-tempered, and I'll bet there's someone who's hurt him years ago and he was never able to forgive them. Get that right, and you'll get a lot of other things right in your life. One added benefit of this is that people won't ignore you at the grocery store anymore. In other words, you won't be unpleasant to be around anymore. Number 4, bitter people have a guilty conscience. A guilty conscience is part and parcel when it comes to bitterness. But here's the challenging part about identifying this particular problem. Bitter people think it's the other person's sin, not theirs, which means they're blind to their own sin. Jim Wilson notes, quote, again, the reason people do not deal with this sin is that they think it's the other person's sin. The devil says, well, when he quits lying or he quits doing this or that, or when he says he's sorry, then you'll feel better. But suppose he does not quit. Suppose he never quits. Are you going to be bitter the rest of your life because someone else insists in being in sin? End quote. Of course, that's an excellent question. You don't have to be enslaved. You don't have to be controlled by others. Yet many people choose to suffer because of others. Many people choose to be bitter and thus choose to be slaves because of the sins of others. The point here is that you have a guilty conscience, but you cannot recognize it. Let me try to elucidate this phenomenon that's taking place here. Guilt is something that we experience when we sin. Bitterness, on the other hand, is something that happens when others sin against me. So why do I experience feelings of guilt? Because while it is true that bitterness happens when others sin against me, bitterness itself is sin. This is why this is such an unusual phenomenon. It's odd because we have feelings of guilt, but we don't understand them because we are certain that it's the other person's sin, not mine, and so we don't deal with it. One evidence of a guilty conscience is described in Proverbs 28:1. The wicked flee when no one pursues, but the righteous are as bold as a lion. Even if you don't see yourself as bitter or having a guilty conscience, if you tend to always be looking over your shoulder or avoiding people, you might be guilty. Or you're always suspicious of others, or suspicious of their intentions, or suspicious of their motives, you may be bitter. It's important to note that if you are bitter, you are in sin, and your conscience will convict you of that. There's a dangerous process that we can follow to sear our consciences. It's possible that your conscience will afflict you initially, but eventually it will become quiet and leave you alone. The process of searing your conscience is dangerous and is warned against in Scripture. We actually have a name today for searing your conscience. It's a process that you can follow that will result in the successful destruction and searing of your conscience. Today, we call the process of searing your conscience therapy. Number 5, bitter people are gossips. Bitter people are gossips. This particular fruit of bitterness is obvious. Misery, of course, loves company, and there's nothing more delightful to the bitter person than to talk about their wounds with others. Ephesians 4:31, I read this earlier, let's read it again. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you along with all malice. What I find interesting about this particular verse is that slander is in the same vice list as bitterness. Of course, it could be random. Paul could just be giving a random assortment of sins list, but I don't think that's the case, because these sins seem to be connected with one another. They're in the same family. You've got bitterness and wrath and anger. Those definitely are cousins. And you've got at the end of the verse, malice, which is ill will towards others. That has to do with your motivation. When you're bitter and angry, you tend to wish ill on others. That's malice. But in the middle here, you have clamor and slander. These are the verbal ones. These are the verbal manifestations of the anger and the bitterness and the wrath and the malice. Clamor is yelling and shouting, and slander is blaspheming others. So these are the verbal manifestations of bitterness. One author says that bitter people like to advertise themselves as a safe space for others to process hurt. Have you been hurt by the church? Come and talk with me. I can provide you a safe space to process your hurt. That's code for let's get together and gossip about all of our hurts and slander others and trauma dump together. Well, that's the 5th one, and there's a lot more. I'm going to conclude with a list of symptoms, kind of a random splattering of symptoms of bitterness. This is just something that was given by one author, and I'm really paraphrasing these significantly, but I'm going to just read off this list here to you of some final concluding thoughts on symptoms of bitterness. Sleeplessness, by the way, that's caused by thinking about things constantly. Fatigue, which is due to the sleeplessness. Misery, you're a Debbie Downer. Suspicious of others. Disappointed in everything. Irritability. Sarcasm, of course, I love sarcasm as much as the next person, but there certainly is a brand of sarcasm that is characteristic of the bitter person, that has a lot of truth behind it. Another one here is misery loves company. Another one is sees the negative, never the good. Another one talks about their wounds constantly. And then the final one is excuses for disobedience. And of course, there's a lot of others, but this covers it for now. And Lord willing, we will continue with this podcast series next week. Thanks for listening to CrossView Radio. I'm John Marino, pastor of CrossView Church Norville. We meet Sundays at 9 a.m. To find out more about CrossView Church, visit us online at crossvieworville.com.